Welcome to Regulate Tech. This is our seventh episode of the year. And this time around, we're going to discuss something that's often associated with public policy teams and government affairs, but quite different. And it's the question of what is sometimes referred to as corporate social responsibility, ESG, or philanthropy. So, how should you think about this as a part of public policy, or shouldn't it be a part of public policy? How can companies approach the question of how they are good corporate citizens? And what should you absolutely not expect to get from your work in CSR, ESG, or philanthropy? So, Richard, where should we start? Let's talk about the acronyms. There's so many of them: CSR, ESG. What's the difference? How would you tease that out for somebody? And what's philanthropy vis-a-vis the other two?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'd say philanthropy is almost the classic thing that rich people do. And so actually you see it in things like the Gates Foundation and you see it the Chan Zuckerberg Foundation. So I think your classic philanthropy is it's typically about individuals, actually. Individuals have made a lot of money and want to spend that money contributing to solving problems in the world. I think that's your core philanthropy. And I think it's rare that businesses themselves are engaged in sort of direct philanthropy. It tends to be more the rich founders of a business that will do that. There are some businesses that are themselves arguably philanthropic, or they operate in a business-like manner, but they're philanthropic, and there are different sort of categories of those. There are things called B Corps, B corporations, and community interest companies, and there are businesses that essentially have a sort of philanthropic. If we go back to the Greek, phil, love of, anthropos, men, love of people. So your sort of business is itself geared towards that. Actually, kind of in a weird way,
social entrepreneurship, right? The idea that your entrepreneurship is geared against maximizing social utility rather than economic utility.
Exactly, and they say that can be incorporated in the way business is set up. When a business, though, is set up as a business with shareholders for profit that are going to make money from it, I think it's very hard to argue its primary purpose is philanthropic. Although, in a way, this is where the tech companies have often got in trouble, that they've sort of given a perception that they see themselves as essentially philanthropic. We're building this service to liberate the world's information or connect the people of the world, and they sort of come across as saying, our core mission. I think, and you believe it. Your core mission, essentially, you frame in philanthropic terms, but ultimately,
this is where you get hit with the satire of "we want to make the world a better place." That's the place you're describing, right?
Exactly, and that, as I say, it creates a set of expectations that I think, as I say, I have some sympathy for it, but it's overstated in many cases. If your business is set up as a classic for-profit organization with shareholders, because ultimately that's your core founding principle, is that you must make money for those shareholders. That's the base on which they're giving you the money. So that's where you often get a sort of conflict. So I think, say, founders can often be hugely philanthropic as individuals, taking the money out of the business, taking shares from the business and diverting them towards philanthropic causes. Businesses can see themselves in philanthropic terms, but I would hesitate to describe them as purely philanthropic unless they've set up under one of these alternative structures. And there are examples, like I think Mozilla is set up through the Mozilla Foundation. There are examples in the tech sector, Wikimedia Foundation. Those are... So the difference between Wikimedia and Google is that, Wikimedia is expressly set up for a philanthropic purpose to make information available to the world, has no shareholders, no profit. Google similarly is making information available to the world, more information by degree, but has shareholders and seeks to make a profit. So I don't think it's philanthropic in the same way. So that's philanthropy.
Let's dig in on that a little bit, because I think it's interesting to think about the differences from a policy perspective. Now, if you're doing policy for the Wikimedia Foundation, or if you're doing policy for a company that has a proper charter that is a B corporation, as you say, or a philanthropic organization or a social entrepreneur, you will be working slightly different with policy, and you will take the philanthropic purpose of the company and make that the core of your policy advocacy, will you not? That seems to be really like the natural way to go.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, sometimes, I think we've seen this, you'll position yourself as being different from those greedy capitalists over there, and that's the smart way to do it. So yes, if you're representing an organization that is pure in mission, its mission is purely a social purpose, then you're right. The logical lead argument you're going to make is, look, we're different from those others. You're having a debate about tech policy, and sat around the table are a bunch of for-profit corporations who are saying, we just want to do good for the world. If you're sat at that same table representing an organization with one of these not-for-profit structures, then yes, your lead is going to be, well, I am more trustworthy than them because my organization only has the public interest at heart and is not sort of split with trying to make profits.
Will it make it hard for you to agree with the for-profit companies, even when you do?
I mean, I think sometimes you do, but it's interesting because there's a movement, and we've seen this, of people who move between, the sectors. Actually, typically it tends to be from, the not-for-profit sector into the for-profit sector, because there'll be better salaries and sort of more opportunities in the for-profit sector. So you do see that movement. So there is some connection to the people. I think the people often get on with each other. I love the not-for-profit people I would get on with. But what can be challenging is look, it's market positioning, and they're, in a sense, they're competing for relevance, attention, influence. And one of the tools of competition that you have if you're in the not-for-profit is to bash the for-profits. And so there, is it like in politics? If you're, from one political party in public, you're going to bash the other political party. You may then go to the bar afterwards and get on very well as individuals, but the dynamic is there, and it's, in a way, it's a healthy dynamic. I don't say that to be critical. It is healthy that people are testing and bashing at powerful organizations. So there's a healthy dynamic there. But I say at a private level, people often get on with each other, and there's quite a lot of sort of flow between the organizations in terms of individual staff, because these are people who are interested in technology and policy at heart. And you can do that from lots of different angles, as I've done during my career and others have done. You can move between these organizations and still be working on technology policy.
Yes, I think that's right. And the observation I would make in addition to that is that it might mean that rather than making a full-throated defense of intermediary liability, for example, you might want to have a carve-out for those organizations that are not for profit. So you end up with a slightly different ask, especially in a challenging policy climate where you know that defending a blanket principle is going to be near impossible, but defending the carve-out is easier. So there's a different set of incentives and options and tools, really, when you're working for the not-for-profit organization, and it creates a really interesting dynamic. And I agree with you. I think it's sometimes a healthy dynamic because it forces legislators then to think about how much do we want our regulation to be generally applicable, and how much do we want to create these carve-outs from it, and what is the motivation for the carve-out. And that's where they sort of have to think a little bit about your question, the question of where's the harm. And I think that can actually be really helpful.
And I think that's particularly true, yes, if the not-for-profit is operating a service. And again, the Wikipedia one would be the prime example. If you're creating a regime that says, look, we're going to make you, take extra expensive measures to manage content to make sure none of it's bad or infringes copyright or whatever, it's perhaps reasonable to say we're going to put those extra burdens on a for-profit company. They've got money coming in. There is a rationale to say, but it's inappropriate to place those extra burdens on a not-for-profit run by volunteers where they don't have the resources, perhaps, to do the same kind of policing. At the same time, if you're the copyright holder, you're saying, well, I don't care if my copyright material is being distributed on Wikimedia or through Wikimedia services or through Facebook. I don't care. It's still copyright infringement. But that's a classic area where the policymaker needs to kind of make a value judgment and say, look, am I going to treat people who clearly have this social mission differently from those who have an explicit mission to make money and are able to make money, and therefore perhaps can absorb more regulatory burden?
So we have the for-profit companies and we have the not-for-profit companies, and they have different modes and strategies in policy. But then we sort of, you started out talking about personal philanthropy of founders, the idea of setting up a foundation or a family office and engaging in things that you think are important. Now, let's also look at that from a policy perspective. Should you use the personal philanthropy of your founder as an argument for trusting the company generally, or in particular for any issue that the founder might be interested in? Or should you keep a clear line between founder philanthropy and corporate public policy?
Yeah, so I think the preferred model is to keep that clear line. I think that's what the founders want as well. They want to say, look, this is, me doing this as an individual who has been extremely fortunate and made money. And so I think that's the instinct. And again, if you look at what Mark Zuckerberg did, he created the Chan Zuckerberg Foundation. You look at what Bill Gates did, it was the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. They've created foundations that are sort of ad personam, in their own identities. They're often doing work that is not necessarily related to the company's business at all. Chan Zuckerberg very much focuses on health, and delivering healthcare is not a Facebook core business. And Gates has focused on a lot of things like microfinance and environmental issues, which again are not Microsoft core business. So I think that's kind of what you want, but it's really hard to disentangle the two. People do associate companies very strongly with their founders. In the case of Microsoft, Bill Gates is well distant, but still, when you say Bill Gates, people think Microsoft. When you say Microsoft, people think Bill Gates. And so it's really hard to disentangle these, because people will make those associations, and will make some judgment about whether a company is being run by a good person based on what that person's activities are outside. So hard, but I say, like structurally, you really should think of them as quite separate, because they are often operating in other areas, and they do reflect a different set of conversations from the conversation that the founder is having at work. They're not to do with the products or the product design.
But it's hard, because there are two things, there are two aspects of this that I really like in your conversation. One is the spillover effect that you're sort of hoping for if you're in the public policy or government affairs space. You're thinking that people will look at this and say, look, okay, they're making a lot of money, but they're using the money well, for example, or they're making a lot of money, but they seem to be directing towards really worthy causes, and that's great. And I think there's a trap there, right? Because if you're hoping too much for that, from that spillover effect, if you blur the line, you might end up in a situation where every piece of personal giving that a founder engages in becomes a signal for worth the corporation is. And this brings us into the complex and highly interesting area of political philanthropy, like political campaign funding, etc., that individual founders may engage in different ways. So there's like if you blur the line, you should count on everything on the other side of the line coming back to you, and you have to own that, right?
That's right. Yeah, and the political side of things is tough. Individual founders have political views as well, and they're entitled to them. But every move they make will be exaggerated. So, you or I could give some money to a campaign or a candidate if we wanted to, and it's not that exciting. But when a founder, somebody who's sort of very senior in a company does, it becomes seen as very sort of symbolic of, again, the company's position. And it's really hard to disentangle the two. I think there was I know that Mark Zuckerberg, for example, was very interested in things like immigration reform in the United States. And I think that was a personal issue that he cared about, as well as being an issue that was interesting for the company. But it's so sensitive that as soon as, you see somebody like him getting involved in an issue like that, it gets blown up out of all proportion. So I think the political area is really difficult. Again, the safest course is to try and steer clear. And not end up being too closely associated with any politician. Some people will play the both sides game. I'm not convinced by that. I'll just fund them all. But I think the safest game, in a way, is to stick to areas where you're keeping as far away from politics or direct politics as you can. Albeit everything is political, but funding like a healthcare research project is I think much less vulnerable to being read as the company's position than funding, as I say, something like immigration reform, where people are going to
It's
say
always
that's
hard in the
really.
US, though, where there's like an expectation or almost an expectation for you to engage in political giving. It's such a different, in that particular aspect, I think it's a very different environment to the rest of the world, really.
Yeah, the fact you didn't give is seen as indicative of something as well,
Yes.
and you're absolutely right. It is pretty unique, I think, that very clear association between politicians going round with a very big begging bowl and the expectation that part of playing the game is to fund those politicians.
Yes. And so, okay, we have the personal philanthropic giving, we have the non-profit company, the profit company, the distinction. But as we're sort of looking at, and there's like a deeper question here about the role of a company, and it's an ongoing debate across all industries, I think. Is a company a profit maximization vehicle for shareholders, or does it actually have moral duties and obligations? And there was a couple of years ago, there was this this large letter written by several CEOs in the US saying that we are no longer content with being profit maximization vehicles. We also believe we have a moral responsibility, et cetera, et cetera. So that's an ongoing discussion, and it's in the midst of that discussion that a lot of companies are now trying to orient themselves, and as they do so, they have to look at what we can refer to as traditional CSR as well as
Yeah.
ESG. What is CSR then?
Yeah, so there's corporate social responsibility. So I guess that's the classic thing. So this is like we're assuming the company is for profit,
Yes.
but we're asking it to demonstrate corporate social responsibility. I guess as you always flip it around. What would be corporate antisocial irresponsibility? So that would be a company like not caring about society and being careless as to its impact on society. So CSR was sort of coined as a way of saying, look, we have an expectation of companies that yes, they're going to maximize profits, make profits. And by the way, if people are interested in that, I just read a really interesting book by a guy called Alec Ross, who used to work for Hillary Clinton, called The Raging 2020s, which is really good sort of dive into this subject of shareholder versus stakeholder capitalism and how, we are at this juncture where companies can go either way. But assuming that they are remaining capitalist and profit making, CSR was a way of demonstrating that they did feel responsible in some way towards society, and that they were willing to make a kind of pro-social contribution. And actually, in its sort of first incarnation, it's things like, oil companies having kind of obliterated some area of natural beauty to extract oil, paying for education and social facilities for the people in that area. So that was seen as corporately social responsible. They didn't, they could have just gone in, taken the oil, and said that's it, that our responsibility ends. But they would go in, take the oil, cause the obliteration, but pay something back into those local communities in order to enable them to deal with the fallout from it. So that sort of original kind of CSR type stuff was, I think, very much associated with businesses showing they were prepared to clean up after themselves. That sort of morphed into this ESG concept, which is environmental social governance. And I think perhaps it's just taking it a little bit further. It's a bit more explicit, and it's saying what we're expecting of you. So environmental is critical. That's a new thing. So that's companies sort of demonstrating that they are taking steps not to worsen the environment. Social is almost your classic sort of CSR piece again. That's rolled over into it. And then governance is quite interesting, that there's, to say you're an ESG company, you've got to demonstrate that you've got good governance as well. And that's areas like corruption and how directors are appointed and how shareholders can have a voice in the company. All of those kind of factors come into that.
And I think another interesting difference, if you go back to the history of CSR at least, is that CSR seems to be a question of establishing a shared yardstick. This is what we expect from you. This is a standard that you should conform to. And if you actually do all of these things and you check all of these boxes, you will get a CSR certificate almost. So a CSR certification was not far off from what a lot of the companies looking into CSR wanted. The value of CSR to a large degree was in the agreement from the stakeholders and the shareholders on what responsibility meant. and that agreement then allowed companies to put in place CSR programs and CSR officers and the CSR audits where they could say we are a responsible company because we fulfill the standards that have been set out for us here. Now, I think that one of the shifts that happens when we move from CSR to ESG, not to exaggerate it, but one of the shifts is that the yardstick goes away, and it's more about show me what you got and show me that you're better than your peers. So it becomes more competitive rather than conformist to a standard. And I think that's a very clear difference between the traditional CSR models and the emerging ESG models. That they are more, if it's not de minimis but sort of conform to a standard, this is more compete about the lead role as an environmental, social, or properly governed company. Do you think that resonates?
I mean, I think the standards have been increasing over time. Not just so I think, your classic sort of CSR was here's my CSR report. I put out once a year. You're right. You build all the structure. You kind of tick all the boxes, and here's my report, and it shows how I funded this school or this program, or and it makes the company sort of look and feel good about itself, and that was valuable. It's not to dismiss it, but that was more, showcase the good things you've done. You're right. I think two things have happened. One is I think the ESG sort of model is more competitive, as you say. I think it's driving investment decisions. That's a critical difference. So indexes, you kind of have the index of all the stock of all the companies that an investor could buy. And then you had the index of all the stock except the really naughty ones. So the sort of arms and tobacco and people like that. And now you're getting indexes that are based on ESG, actually looking for companies that really are the best. So in a sense, to your point about competition, it's saying, I want an index of companies that really take the environment seriously, their social considerations seriously, are well governed. And so it's gone beyond a very simplistic division into a more complex assessment of those companies, and you can have a sort of league table and ranking now on these kind of considerations. So I think that's one thing. The other thing that's been happening, and it's worth bringing in, is that there's a whole bunch of external standards have been set up. So again, it's no longer confined to here's my CSR report, here's me telling you about myself. There are now a whole bunch of external benchmarks. It's not internal benchmarks now. There are these external ones. For example, there's a business and human rights sort of instruments that have been constructed. In the clothing industry, there's a whole bunch of supply chain standards that have been established. In the tech sector, there's things like the Global Network Initiative, commitments that companies are making. So I think we've seen a growth over the last 20 or 30 years of a range of external standards that companies are also trying to comply with. European Commission codes on various things, codes of practice you sign up to. So there's all of those things, plus this sort of ESG model. And I think that's all much more demanding than the previous sort of CSR model, which was, I think, more under control of the organizations. They set the benchmark, they put out their showcase. They had quite a lot of control over the way in which they implemented CSR.
So let's talk about the newest iteration then, ESG. As a policy head, if you're sort of a policy head of an organization, the leadership comes to you and say, we probably need an ESG program. How should we think about that? How should we organize it? Sounds like something policy should own. I think you should probably drive this, and then just go fix it and tell us how much money you need, and then that's pretty much it. What's your response to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to analyze the problem you're trying to solve. And I don't think the problem is, just make the company look good. I think the problem, you're analyzing a bunch of different problems. And I think it's really important to do that analysis. And I would say put budgets against each of those areas. So just to sort of break out some of them. And if you do this analysis for your business, I think you'll find each business will be unique. But some of the issues you have are, for example, your impact on local communities, which is where you have significant footprint on the ground. And so there'll be a bunch of considerations there, environmental and social and governance considerations about how you engage with the local community, the environmental impact of buildings that you are building, the social impact of your transport and things like that on a particular community you're in, how you engage with the local authorities. There are lots of governance questions about do you openly and transparently engage with them? Are you seen as bullying local government when you're trying to get things done? So a whole bunch of local considerations associated with footprint. There's
And that's
another,
usually that's packaged like something called community affairs, right?
yeah,
So you're talking about community affairs, and that is the local communities in which your company has a significant footprint, and you want to make sure that you're in good standing. So that's community affairs. Should that be organized under public policy?
I mean, I think it has there's no doubt it has a policy element because, your interaction as a company is often mediated to the community through whatever the local government structures are. And so, again, it's quite hard to avoid that. I think the risk is that you are seen, it's the classic lobbying trap, that you're seen as only doing things in the local community in order to get things like planning permission and get your way. So that's obviously the risk. I think but as I say, don't know what's the alternative. I mean, if you are trying to expand in an area, you should be working with the local governance structures, and to work outside of them or around them, I think, is problematic. So I think it inevitably ends up with quite a large sort of policy dimension because the people you're dealing with on the other side are themselves in the political world. They will be local government people typically, or local community organizers. So I think that one is sort of in that area, but the expertise you need is largely not political expertise. So it's real expertise in things like environmental impact, traffic management, education. So it may have a policy interface, but it's really important that it's not that the people sort of making decisions about what's the right kind of investment to make are not policy people, but actual experts in whatever it is you're looking at. So I think, again, a really well-run team will have policy people in there for this community relationship to work with local government, but they'll be backed up by really strong experts in all the areas that matter. And the areas that matter will be to do with social impact and environmental impact in that community.
And it's different from different companies, right? You can imagine companies that have to engage deeply in mayoral politics, where they have to be in the city sort of political space, and they also will have a huge footprint in that space. I'm thinking about a company like, say Lyft or Uber or any other ride-hailing companies. Really, for them, community affairs becomes a policy issue. So it depends a little bit on the company sort of business too, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think maybe one helpful way to think about it is to take the ESG framing that the policy people provide the G bit. There has to be, they're the experts in G. There has to be good governance on the company side in your relationship with the government on the other side. But you also need S people, social people, and E people, environmental people. So I think if you don't want it all to be driven by the G, but there has to be G in there in those terms of those community relations.
It sort of answers it sort of answers the first question that we were noodling on, which is you can't just have an ESG team within a public policy team, because that wouldn't work, right?
Yeah. I think I say particularly in this local area, it doesn't work, and you'll be judged by your actual impact. What was your impact on that community? You can't kind of politically spin that away. So it's got to be meaningful. And as I say, I would say a community affairs team. Maybe we think of thinking in those terms. You ask who are the environmental and social experts you've got on that team, as well as the policy people. And if it's all policy, it's all G. Then you're probably going to be criticized for making this all about getting political decisions in your favor, and perhaps you should look at that and say, well, is that actually what you're doing? Is that have you really gone into this deeply enough? So it should be an ESG community affairs team. I think is quite a nice way to think about it.
And if we move away from community affairs and we sort of talk generally about corporate strategy and talk about the company as a whole, it's the same thing. You can't just put an ESG team in your public policy team and hope that fixes it, right?
That's right. Yeah. So again, if you look at another area, let's take a sort of concrete area for companies that we used to work for. It would be something like online child safety. And that's a really important social issue for companies to get right. It's actually quite close to their core business. And again, the right way, and you want to make contributions. It's really important. And actually, there's a huge amount of funding that goes into experts in online child safety that comes from the companies, and I think it's kind of quite right and proper. But if it's too driven by the politics, if the reason you're making an investment decision, it's a good investment to make, but you want to be strongly driven by what's effective and what works. And there's a risk it can be too political. It can't be apolitical because it works in a political space. So again, concrete example, you have an organization in the UK called the Internet Watch Foundation that's been around for years, does sterling work taking in reports from the public and making sure that illegal child sex abuse material is taken down, and they'll pursue people who host that content, and you can see that they've dramatically reduced the scope for the hosting of that content by following up. Funded by industry, government sort of expressly sort of stepped back and said, we are happy for this industry funded body to do this work, to complement the work that's done by law enforcement. That's quite proper. But the reason that works effectively is because primarily it's driven by experts in removal of child sexual abuse material, existing within a political framework. And I think that's been, reasonably effective in terms of the job that it does. That's an example, I think, where you've got the experts, you've got the S and the G working together quite effectively to do that.
And so you have your ESG work, which is more than your CSR work. You're sort of engaging in it. You're trying to figure out how to engage the entire company in it, because it can't be just one single team being responsible for it. The ESG strategy needs to be corporate wide, and ultimately it's sort of a leadership issue. If you don't get this right, it's not a single team's responsibility. It's going to be the company's responsibility. And there seem to be two models here that you can adopt. One would be to say, we are going to devise an ESG program that's a flagship program and that really distinguishes us from every other company out there. It's going to be the lead way in which we signal that we are different, that we're responsible, and that we really care about ESG. And the other one is to say, we'll benchmark against the rest of the industry and make sure that we are in the upper quartile, definitely, and that we have a strong, robust program. But we also know, or we think, that a lot of value in an ESG program comes from belonging to a community of corporations that are developing this together. So we won't use it as a differentiator. We will use it to push our industry on and be a part of that. But which model do you think? What are the ups? What are sort of the positives and the negatives with the two models in your view?
I mean, so from a company point of view, and I certainly saw this, if you can't help but be competitive to some extent, and I think particularly if you feel that you're getting unfairly slammed for something that you're quite good at, there is an instinctive temptation to say, look, I'm going to go out and make some big contributions that show that I'm the good guy. And part of me is hoping that people will look at the others and go, oh, yes, they're the bad guys, not you, because you made those big contributions. And so I think that, that is a tool in the box. I'm not sure. I've kind of been on the receiving and the giving end of it. So I think on balance, it rarely sort of really helps in the long term. It may get you through a short term problem that, it sort of is the classic sort of, today's headlines issue, that today's headlines are bad. I make, a big contribution somewhere. I get a good headline for a day or two. I get myself out of the story. I feel I've done okay. But that can leave you a lot of legacy problems in that, now you've committed to funding something, you've got to keep funding it, even if it's no longer the right thing to fund. So I would really strongly urge caution of, what are you tying yourself into here? Is it something you want to do long term, or if you just want the headline, it's maybe a very expensive way of getting the headline because you're sort of making a longer term commitment that you're going to have to get out of. I much more favor the model that you described, the cross-industry model, I think for that reason, that I think it is more sustainable. Again, it can be frustrating because you can end up feeling like you're moving at the pace of the slowest and the most cautious. You come up with a great scheme for how to get ahead of something and you're all in, and then you sit down with some other companies and they may not all be at the same level of development, and some of them want to go slower and so on. But I think that does give you the long-term framework. And again, just to cite some examples, Internet Watch Foundation, again, very long-standing one that was created by industry in response to a real problem, has actually been sustained and maintained over many years. Keep mentioning them. The Global Internet Forum on Counterterrorism, again, cross-industry, came together, all making a contribution, all moving, roughly together. Global Network Initiative, GNI, another one where it was in response to a crisis around, handing data over and people being persecuted as a result, and therefore they came together and created it. So that none of these bodies I'm citing are perfect, but I think they're all really good examples of organizations that have come together, supported by industry, and had a sort of meaningful long-term beneficial impact. They are social goods over the long term. They have governance structures in place that are kind of transparent. You know what's going on. They work well as entities. So maybe that, those are the ones I personally would favor. I think those are the ones that really are meaningful. But if I'm still working for a company and I'm in a hole, the temptation to say, give me some budget to get out of it is always going to be there.
Yes, and what kinds of holes can you not get out of with corporate giving or philanthropy or ESG? Are there cases where you've run into someone asking, have you seen cases where somebody's been asking, look, why don't we just give 100 million to X and show and sort of make this problem go away? Where you think that's just not going to work. That's not how the world works.
I mean, you see it sort of backfiring in a number of different ways. I hesitate to use a Google example, but I remember one of, I think, a cultural institute in Paris where the culture minister refused to go to the opening, if I remember, because they were sort of, yes, so you'll get this, and you can't predict that. And I think we did things as Facebook similarly. So where you've done something, you funded it, and you think you fixed something, and the minister just kind of goes, no, I'm not going to play your game. I think we had some in Germany, similar things where we were funding stuff, and you would get, actually not just that they didn't turn up, but they would create a negative headline to say, I'm not bought off that easily. Fix the core problem. Don't just spend some money on stuff. And we've seen that. We talk about the tax space where companies sort of say, I'm going to pay more tax, and it just backfires. The tax is not voluntary. But I think you sort of see it similarly here. There are plenty of examples where companies have offered to give money, and the narrative has been, you are just trying to buy me off, and that's where it goes wrong.
And the tax example is worth digging into, because there's some, I know if you heard this, but sometimes you hear people say like, yes, we're not paying that much tax, but we're in a completely legal tax structure. What if we instead donate money to X, Y, or Z in the country? And there's a huge difference between tax and donations, right? In the political mind, especially in Europe, I think. Is that right?
Yeah, I think saying we're going to make donations is not at all helpful in the tax debate. Where national donations I think are important. I think this is another thing that sometimes all gets confused. It's something I think should be taken out of the hands of the policy people, is where there is a national crisis and a moment where people feel that they want to give money. And a classic example would be the Notre Dame Cathedral fire in France, for example, where French businesses were queuing up to say, I'm going to contribute to the rebuilding. And you can argue whether that was a worthy cause versus other cause, whatever. The point being that, there was an expectation on businesses in France that they would give to that cause at that moment. And we see this repeatedly where there's a national issue. And there I would say, again, that shouldn't be in the policy team's hands. It often would come to policy teams because they would be the only people who are seen as having discretionary money. And if the government is organizing the fundraising, it's seen as a policy issue. I'd actually say it's not. It's one where I would have a budget sitting with the business leader in that country. And that's a discretionary budget that they can use to fund things that are part of the national narrative, where it is, again, it's actually more classic philanthropy. It's not about a particular policy goal. It's not the thing you're doing. It's just, here is a moment where there's a general feeling that businesses should put their hands in their pockets and give because of a natural disaster or something else that has happened in a particular country. Shouldn't be decided by the centre, shouldn't be decided by policy. But yes, you should make a contribution all the local businesses, if I can frame it that way, will do that. So the local branches of a global business, I think, should be in that club and doing their bit as well.
And that brings us to another issue, which is that there's a lot of folks in companies now who expect their company to have a giving infrastructure where they, for example, match their donations, etc., to worthy causes. So one part of this is we talked about it mostly CSR, ESG, philanthropy as outward directed, but having these programs in place also is important for recruitment, isn't it?
It is. I mean, employees care, and again, another aspect. So they care whether you are seen as a good contributor, and they will now. In the crisis we're in at the moment, if companies are helping their employees organize to provide support to people in Ukraine or refugees fleeing Ukraine right now, that's going to be quite important for how people feel about their employer. Are they supporting them in
And
that?
increasingly important for new generations. Research
they want to
seems
work. They want to work for a company that does good. I mean, that does bring us on to another area. So there's the sort of raising of money. And actually right now, as I understand it, the best help that anyone can give is money. And that includes tech people. We don't need to build stuff necessarily. We need to find money and give it to people. That should be our primary focus. But it also brings us to the question of giving away your product, which is something that does come up quite commonly. And again, you and I will have both experienced this in Google and Facebook as advertising, primarily advertising funded companies, that the product that was often asked for was free advertising. And there were different programs at different times. Again, maybe worth just exploring that a little about how the dynamic of giving your product away. Again, if you were Microsoft, it would be giving away free computers or free software. If you're a social media company, so it's typically giving away advertising and or other forms of attention. Perhaps sometimes helping, with if you've got a fundraising product. If you're a financial services company, it's, are you letting people transact for free, for example, if they're fundraising for a worthy cause? So this sort of product giveaway is also a key part of the requests that are made of companies.
Yes, and it's usually not that simple. I mean, one of the takeaways that I have from that is that I think it was a great willingness to do that, but it required a certain baseline level of skill in order to use the products, because today's advertising products are not simple, which meant that even if you had these programs, the utility and utilization of them was surprisingly low given what it could have been used for. But it's easy to say, why don't you give away X amount of advertising? There needs to be somebody on the other side who can deal with that. And I think one of the things that actually was more powerful, that I think was really interesting, was when you seconded somebody to a philanthropic organization or an NGO to work with them on their social media strategy and advertising strategy, because the skill was much more valuable than the advertising space. At least in my experience. I don't know if you found the same thing.
Yeah, I had the same experience. We would allocate, large blocks of funding for effectively ad giveaway programs, and just as you found, we'd find a lot of it unspent because you could give a voucher away that would allow someone to take on the advertising, but they would really struggle sometimes to use it effectively. And to your point, it is about the skills. The other area, I think, certainly if you're in the advertising world, that I think is quite fruitful, is to work with advertising agencies. So if you pair PAIR, pair up an advertising industry expert, you can pair them up with an NGO and give the credits to that combination. It's much more likely they're going to be able to get a good campaign out the door. I mean, you've also got a whole bunch of issues around compliance. And so again, we will have been through our Foreign and Corrupt Practices Act training, which is very serious and tells you that if you try and use money to influence people in government, you will go to prison if you work for an American company, quite rightly. And we're all, again, seeing a much, much tougher crackdown on corruption right now. And that's a good thing. But that also contains things like, if you were giving away advertising, which is worth money, to an organization, you need to check. For example, there are no politicians on the board of that NGO. And as people will know, it's quite common for politicians or politically connected people to be on boards of NGOs. That's what they do. And so you sort of end up, there's the sort of technical side of things, but you've also got a whole bunch of compliance questions where you're giving away something worth money to an organization that has any kind of connection to politics. You need to be extremely careful. It's not seen as, again, to be candid, that you gave the ads to this NGO because you were trying to win favor with the politician who's on the board of the NGO. And that's not a place you want to be. And so, again, you have a lot of checks and things that sort of create friction and make this a more complex issue than it might appear at first glance. You run ads,
Right.
just give the ads away, job done. It's actually more difficult than that.
Yes. So as we sort of look at this, then it's a complex set of issues. But we've said, from a public policy perspective, if you're a professional, you need to figure out first, of course, if you're engaging with a non-profit or a for-profit company. If it's a non-profit company, your philanthropic focus is probably also going to be your policy advocacy focus, quite rightly. And there is a differentiation to be made between you and other for-profit companies that can be made in a way that's quite healthy and important for the overall debate. That's sort of the first point that we made. The second point we made was that it's probably a good idea to try, to the extent possible, to keep a clear line between personal founder philanthropy and the public policy and government affairs work that you do. Hard, and you may sometimes be sort of pining for those spillover effects. Look, we're good guys, kind of thing. But probably, all in all, best to keep that clear line anyway. And then the sort of the third insight or idea that we sort of looked at was that we seem to have moved from a more formulaic CSR model where companies had a large degree of influence over whether or not they could project responsibility, to a more competitive ESG model in which the companies are trying to be best in class. And as that happens, it's not possible anymore to just have a single team be responsible for this. And I think both you and I probably ended up in a place where we said that we don't think that there should be an ESG sub-team in a public policy team responsible for all of the company's ESG work. That seems a little bit weird. And then lastly, as we sort of dig more deeply into this, we also said that it's really important to find good ways to enable and amplify employee giving, because the modern person who's looking for a place to work wants to work for a place that they think has the right values, and those values need to be reflected in the way that a company can give. But again, to dissociate that from purely policy purposes, it's actually a better idea to give a bag of money to the country manager of a local branch to deal with in those cases where there are local emergencies or cases that the people in the company or country feel strongly about. That sort of seems to, it gives us this, it's a hard area, isn't it, to get right. It's a hard area to you don't want to overstep and then be accused of just saying you're just doing this for your political purposes. On the other hand, you want to do the right thing and you want to enable others to do the right thing. And you actually do want to do the right thing because you think that reflects a company's character. There's an inherent tension here that how do you balance that over time? How do you try to get to, what's the sort of, is it under promise, over deliver, which is one of my favorite overall sort of maxims, or how do you think about it?
I mean, there's a nice summary, I think, of where we've got to on it and what we've learned over the years. I think under promise, over deliver is always a good thing to do, pretty much every area. But I think maybe it's to some. I think that the policy people, if they really focus on the the governance sort of questions of how all of this stuff is governed and really get that bit right, because that's their expertise, is on the politics and the policy. So understanding who's making those decisions, why they're making them, this critical question, what's your true motivation in doing something, and being brutally honest with yourself about that and why you're doing it. I think then you can come up with a sensible program. So when you've got stuff which you are, you're essentially funding, say, organizations to kind of do some cleanup around some of the potential harm that comes from your product. Just be honest about that. It's like why you're doing it. You're that's a good, responsible corporation sort of recognize it needs to do that. So there's going to be a whole chunk there, which you say is your the anti-bad stuff type organizations and bad behavior, working with those people. And then I think there are other times where I say it is just pure for love of humanity. You want to do things, nothing to do with your actual business. But again, just like being really honest about when you're doing these different things and making sure you have good governance structures in place that control that, and making sure you're not almost falling into the trap of deceiving yourself and doing things for the wrong motives, or doing things, because they'll just make you think they'll make you look good. Because A, they probably won't make you look good over the long term, and B, people are smart and they sort of will see that for exactly what it is. So again, I think that being really clear, being really open, and having a really smart governance model, and not as you just described, linking everything back to policy and thinking that this is all about policy objectives. It's much broader than that.
And it goes back to, there's an old distinction in literary theory about showing and telling, right? And I think that to a large degree, what you want your ESG work to be is to show what you're doing. You don't want to have to tell people, which ties into the comms discussion. I don't know if you ever had this, but I ran across a number of cases and other people in other organizations that have sort of had the same problem, where they have been faced with the company saying, we do so many good things, but we don't get credit for them. We should go out there and tell people about all of the good things we do. And you're like, oh, not entirely sure that will work, because telling them about it will make those things less good. And that's a tension. I mean, I'm thinking about the specific case that to this day irks me a little bit, and that is the enormous amount of open source being produced by the tech industry and just handed out for free, essentially. And people go like, oh, it's not for free because you're trying up your server. No, it's actually for free. It's contributions to open source projects that are super interesting and very valuable. And I think it's almost impossible for a tech company at this point to get credit for that by telling people, look, here is how many lines of code we gave away this year. Yet it is a huge contribution. How do you manage that?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with you. I think the quiet giving, I used to, in the days when Facebook was a popular brand back in the day, and people would still want to be associated with it, I would sometimes give money, to things and say, look, I don't particularly want the co-branding. It's enough for me to know that this event happened, with our support. You don't need to put my branding everywhere. And actually, I used to really dislike, and still do dislike, this whole thing of gold, platinum, silver packages with your logo in these. Anyway,
Please stop with that, because you'd almost like to have it be reversed, right? So if I give platinum, you won't talk about what we do.
Yeah, you just want to. You should be giving the money because you want that event to happen. That should be your primary motive, and not as a publicity exercise. And I think that's a much better way to judge whether it's worth putting money in, and worth participating and being a speaker. All those sort of questions are about the value of the thing.
I don't think I've ever belonged to a policy team that gave a lot of money to those platinum, gold, those kinds of conferences. Marketing may have, but I don't think policy ever did. Did you do that? Might be a tip from us, actually. It's hugely ineffective.
Yeah, I mean, my instinct was not to, but occasionally I would get my arm twisted because they say, "Oh, the guys at Google are gold sponsors."
Okay, nice.
So maybe that was the sales people on the other side. Yeah, so it's like, we're lining everybody up. Do you want your logo to be the one that's missing here? So they
want a smaller font beneath the Google. Okay, good.
Exactly. So you get there would be some competitive stuff, but I prefer that you give it because you want the thing to happen, and the people who are there know who supported them and made the thing happen. Just as you point out, though, as the brands become more toxic, and candidly that's what they are now, then that dynamic has sort of shifted anyway to now where people don't particularly want to put you up front. But then you have this other thing, which is suspicion. Did you take money from Google or Facebook? That makes you a bad person. So now the worry is they're secretly funding you, and so the sort of the quiet model is also run down as well. So I don't know. I think there's a real challenge there, and we're not being honest about it.
And we should get back to the question of academic funding and academics and how to think about that. That's actually a really big and interesting area that we should dig more into in a later episode, I think. That's
exactly
good.
But I mean, I'm dealing with the fact checkers now, and you get this call of, social media platforms should pay to clean up the bad content, and so social media companies give money to fact checkers, and then it's, oh my god, the fact checkers are biased because they're all being paid by the social media companies. Like, we've got to decide, like, do we want them to pay to clean up, or do we want the government to pay the fact checkers while the social media companies get the cleaning up for free? Like none of these are great options, but we've got to make a decision. And I feel like a lot of the time when we're sort of arguing in both directions simultaneously, it's not helpful.
Oh, but that's at the heart of public policy, to be able to do that. So I think that sums it up. A difficult issue, certainly one that is going to be much more important in the coming 5 years, I think. And I think the transformation of CSR into ESG is going to challenge companies in entirely new ways. So very worthwhile looking more into this issue. But we'll close here, and you can find the podcast on your website, which is
www.regulate.tech.
And thank you so much for listening in. See you, or listen, hear you, speak to you next episode.
Speak to you. Yes.
Yes.